In a bustling suburban neighborhood of Minneapolis, where modest homes lined the quiet streets, lived 12-year-old Adam Chen with his father, David. Their small two-bedroom house might have seemed unremarkable to passers-by, but within its walls lay a story of resilience, hard work, and a bond between father and son that would soon teach their community an unforgettable lesson. Adam was a bright student who always tried his best, despite the challenges life had thrown at him. 3 years ago, he lost his mother to cancer, and since then, it had been just him and his dad. David worked long hours at what Adam believed was an office job, often coming home late at night with tired eyes but never too exhausted to help with homework or share a warm meal. The new semester at Pine Grove Middle School had started promisingly, but everything changed when Mrs. Reynolds took over as the substitute math teacher. From her first day, she carried herself with an air of superiority that made the students uncomfortable. Her sharp eyes seemed to search for flaws, and her red pen was always ready to mark errors with unnecessary flourish. One particularly challenging week, Adam struggled with his algebra homework. His father had been away on what he called an important business trip, and the young boy had to manage on his own. The problem seemed to swim before his eyes as he worked late into the night, determined to complete the assignment. The next morning, Adam arrived at school with dark circles under his eyes but proud that he'd finished every single problem. He handed in his homework with a mixture of exhaustion and hope, only to have Mrs. Reynolds snatch it from his hands with barely a glance. Later that day, as she returned the graded assignments, her heels clicked ominously against the linoleum floor. She stopped at Adam's desk, holding his paper between two fingers as if it were contaminated. "Well, well," she announced loudly, making sure the entire class could hear. "It seems some of us don't understand the basic concept of effort." Adam's heart sank as she placed his paper face down on his desk. Red marks covered nearly every problem, and at the top, in bold letters, she had written, "See me after class. This is unacceptable." When the bell rang, Adam approached her desk with trembling hands. Mrs. Reynolds didn't even look up from her phone as she spoke. "Your work is atrocious. If you can't handle middle school math, perhaps you should consider a different educational path. Not everyone is cut out for academic success." Tears welled up in Adam's eyes, but he fought them back. "I tried my best, Mrs. Reynolds. My dad was away, and dash." "Excuses," she cut him off sharply. "Your father's absence is not my concern. If he cared about your education, perhaps he'd be more present. What does he do anyway? Stock shelves at the grocery store?" The cruel assumption about his father stung more than any criticism of his homework. Adam wanted to tell her how his dad worked tirelessly, how he'd taught himself advanced math to help Adam study, how he'd never missed a parent-teacher conference despite his busy schedule. But the words wouldn't come. What Adam didn't know was that at that very moment, his father was walking through the halls of Pine Grove Middle School. David Chen had just returned from his business trip and decided to surprise his son with lunch. He was wearing his usual modest attire, simple jeans and a navy sweater that gave no indication of his true identity. As David approached the classroom, he heard Mrs. Reynolds' sharp voice through the half-open door. He paused, listening as she continued to berate his son. His expression remained calm, but his eyes took on a determined glint. Few people knew that David Chen wasn't just another office worker. He was the CEO of one of the largest educational technology companies in the country, and he had just spent the past week meeting with the school district's Board of Education about implementing a new learning platform. The story of what happened next would soon spread through the entire school community, teaching valuable lessons about humility, judgment, and the power of treating every person with respect. But for now, David Chen stood quietly in the hallway, planning how to handle this situation in a way that would not only defend his son but also create positive change in their school system. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the classroom windows, neither Mrs. Reynolds nor Adam realized that this moment would mark the beginning of a transformation that would touch not just their lives, but the entire Pine Grove community. The homework covered in red marks would become more than just a graded assignment, it would become a symbol of how quick judgments and prejudice can blind us to the extraordinary stories of ordinary people. David Chen took a deep breath and straightened his sweater before knocking on the classroom door. The sharp sound interrupted Mrs. Reynolds mid-sentence, and she turned with visible irritation at being disturbed. Her expression quickly shifted to one of forced politeness when she saw an adult standing in the doorway. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone artificially sweet, completely different from how she had been speaking to Adam moments before. "Yes, actually," David replied quietly, stepping into the classroom. "I'm Adam Chen's father." His voice was calm but carried an underlying strength that made Mrs. Reynolds unconsciously take a step back. Adam's eyes widened with surprise and relief at seeing his father. "Dad! I thought you were still on your business trip." "I came back early, buddy. I thought we could have lunch together." David smiled warmly at his son before turning back to Mrs. Reynolds. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation just now. Would you mind explaining why you feel it's appropriate to make assumptions about my career and my parenting?" Mrs. Reynolds's face flushed, but she quickly composed herself. "Mr. Chen, I was simply expressing concern about Adam's recent performance. His last homework assignment showed a complete lack of understanding of basic concepts." David walked over to Adam's desk and picked up the homework covered in red marks. As he examined it, his expression remained thoughtful. "I see. And did you offer to help him understand these concepts, or did you jump straight to suggesting he wasn't cut out for academic success?" The classroom fell silent. Even the sound of traffic outside seemed muted as Mrs. Reynolds struggled to find a response. "Mr. Chen, I have 28 students to manage. I can't provide individual attention to every student who fails to grasp the material." "Interesting," David said, pulling out his phone. "Would you mind if I took a picture of this homework? I think the Board of Education would be very interested in seeing it during our meeting tomorrow." News of what happened in Mrs. Reynolds's classroom spread through Pine Grove Middle School like wildfire. By the next morning, the story had taken on a life of its own, with students excitedly sharing details in hushed voices between classes. However, what happened next would surprise everyone. Principal Thompson called an unexpected assembly first thing in the morning. The students filed into the auditorium, buzzing with speculation about whether it had anything to do with yesterday's events. Adam sat quietly in the middle row, trying to avoid the curious glances from his classmates. As Principal Thompson approached the podium, he wasn't alone. David Chen stood beside him, dressed in a casual business suit that still somehow made him look more like a dad than a CEO. Mrs. Reynolds sat on stage as well, her usual stern expression replaced by one of thoughtful reflection. "Good morning, students," Principal Thompson began. "We're here today to talk about something important, how we treat each other, and how we can do better as a school community." He paused, looking out at the sea of young faces. "Yesterday, an incident in our school reminded us that we never truly know someone's story. Mr. Chen, would you like to share your thoughts?" David stepped forward, his presence commanding attention without intimidation. "Thank you, Principal Thompson. You know, when I was your age, I was a lot like many of you. I struggled with math, too. My English wasn't perfect because I had just moved to this country. Some teachers believed in me, others didn't. The difference those who believed made in my life was enormous." The auditorium was silent now, every student hanging on his words. Even the usual troublemakers in the back row sat up straighter. "But I'm not here to talk about my success story," David continued. "I'm here to talk about something more important, the power of respect, understanding, and second chances. Mrs. Reynolds has something she'd like to share with you all." As Mrs. Reynolds stood up, something was different about her. The rigid posture and cold demeanor were gone, replaced by a genuine vulnerability that none of her students had seen before. "Yesterday," she began, her voice slightly shaky but clear, I made a serious mistake. I judged a student based on assumptions. I forgot that my role as a teacher isn't just to grade papers, it's to guide, support, and inspire. She looked directly at Adam. I forgot that every student has a story, has challenges, has potential. And I'm standing here today not just to apologize, but to commit to doing better. What happened next surprised everyone. Mrs. Reynolds pulled out a piece of paper, Adam's homework from yesterday. I'd like to go through this assignment now, with all of you. Not to point out mistakes, but to show you something I missed yesterday. Adam's approach to these problems was actually quite creative. Different from what I expected, yes, but not wrong. Using the projector, she displayed the homework on the large screen behind her. With newfound patience and clarity, she explained how Adam had solved the algebra problems using a method his father had taught him, a method that, while unconventional, demonstrated a deep understanding of mathematical concepts. Innovation doesn't always look like what we expect, David added, stepping forward again. That's why EDU Tech Solutions is partnering with Pine Grove to launch a new kind of learning program. One that recognizes and celebrates different ways of thinking and learning. Principal Thompson returned to the podium, excitement evident in his voice. Starting next week, we're implementing new after-school programs. Not just for math, but for all subjects. These won't be ordinary tutoring sessions, they'll be collaborative learning spaces where students can explore different ways to solve problems, help each other, and work with teachers in a more relaxed environment. The assembly continued with details about the new programs, but something more important was happening in that auditorium. Students who had felt invisible began to sit up straighter. Those who had been afraid to ask questions felt a glimmer of hope. And those who had been quick to judge others began to reconsider their perspectives. After the assembly, as students filed out, several stopped to talk to Adam. Not to ask about his dad being a CEO, but to share their own stories of struggling with subjects and feeling misunderstood. One girl admitted she had been afraid to ask questions in class for fear of being ridiculed. A boy confessed he had been considering dropping out of advanced math because he felt he didn't belong. Mrs. Reynolds spent her lunch break in her classroom, completely reorganizing her teaching materials. When Adam passed by later that day, he saw her working with another student, her approach noticeably different, more patient, more encouraging, more human. That afternoon, as Adam walked home with his father, he had dozens of questions spinning in his mind. But one seemed more important than the others. "Dad," he began thoughtfully, "when Mrs. Reynolds was mean to me yesterday, you could have gotten her fired. You could have made a big scene. Why didn't you?" David smiled, considering his answer carefully. "Because sometimes, buddy, the best way to handle someone's mistake is to help them learn from it." Mrs. Reynolds needed a chance to grow, just like every student in her class needs that same chance. But what if she hadn't wanted to change? Adam pressed. Then that would have been her choice, and we would have handled things differently, David replied honestly. But you know what I've learned in business and in life? Most people want to do better when they're given the opportunity and the tools to do so. Sometimes they just need someone to believe in them, just like you needed someone to believe in your way of solving those math problems. As they walked, neither father nor son noticed the small group of teachers watching them from the school windows, already discussing how they could improve their own teaching methods. The ripple effect of one homework assignment was just beginning to spread through Pine Grove Middle School, touching lives in ways that would continue long after the initial incident was forgotten. A week had passed since the assembly, and Pine Grove Middle School was experiencing changes that no one had expected. The after-school learning program had launched with remarkable success, but it wasn't just about academics anymore. Something deeper was transforming within the school's culture. Mrs. Reynolds's classroom had become unrecognizable. Gone were the rigid rows of desks, instead, they were arranged in small groups to encourage collaboration. The walls, once bare except for mathematical formulas, now displayed colorful posters showing different approaches to solving problems. But the most significant change was in her teaching style. "Remember," she said to her class one afternoon, "there's often more than one way to reach the right answer. Adam, would you mind showing us how you approached this problem?" Adam, who once dreaded being called upon, now stood up confidently. As he explained his solution method at the whiteboard, Mrs. Reynolds noticed several students nodding with understanding. His way of breaking down the problem made more sense to them than the traditional method. "That's excellent, Adam," she praised genuinely. "Class, this is exactly why we're learning to appreciate different perspectives. Sometimes the best way to understand something is to see it through someone else's eyes." After class, a quiet student named Ray approached Mrs. Reynolds's desk. His eyes were fixed on the floor as he spoke. "Mrs. Reynolds? I think I've been solving problems like Adam does, but I've been changing my answers to match the textbook way because I thought I was wrong." Mrs. Reynolds felt a pang in her heart, remembering her own rigid attitudes from just a week ago. "Ray, would you be willing to show me your original solutions? I think they could help other students too." Meanwhile, David Chen's involvement with the school had sparked interest from other parents. The monthly PTA meeting, usually attended by the same handful of dedicated parents, was packed with people eager to learn about the new learning initiative. "The success we're seeing isn't just about the technology," David explained to the crowded cafeteria. "It's about changing how we think about education. Every parent here has a unique perspective that could benefit our children's learning." A mother raised her hand hesitantly. "I'm not a CEO," she said with a nervous laugh, "but I'm an artist. I've noticed my daughter understands geometry better when she can draw it out. Could that be useful?" "Absolutely," David responded warmly. "In fact, we're looking for parents who can share their unique approaches to learning. Your artistic perspective could help students who think visually." The meeting turned into an impromptu brainstorming session, with parents from various backgrounds offering their insights. A mechanic explained how he used car repairs to teach his son about physics. A chef shared how cooking helped her children understand fractions and proportions. Back at home, Adam was experiencing his own transformation. His desk, once cluttered with crumpled papers and erasers, now displayed neatly organized notes. But more importantly, it held a journal where he documented different ways to solve math problems, a project he'd started to help other students. "Dad," he called out one evening, "can you look at something?" David paused his work email and joined his son. "What's up, buddy?" "I'm making this guide for different ways to solve equations," Adam explained, showing his father the journal. "I was thinking maybe it could help other kids who think differently too." David picked up the journal, touched by his son's initiative. The pages were filled with clear explanations and colorful diagrams, each showing a different approach to similar problems. "This is incredible, Adam. You're taking what you learned and using it to help others." "Well," Adam said thoughtfully, "remember that girl in my class, Lily? She helped me understand polynomials better by thinking about them like puzzle pieces. So I added her way to the guide too." The next day at school, Adam's journal caught Mrs. Reynolds' attention. She asked if she could make copies of some pages for her other classes, and soon students from different grade levels were requesting copies. Principal Thompson noticed the ripple effects throughout the school. Disciplinary incidents had decreased significantly. Students were more engaged, and not just in math class. The collaborative approach was spreading to other subjects, with English teachers encouraging different interpretation methods and science teachers embracing various experimental approaches. One morning, as David dropped Adam off at school, he noticed something that made him smile. Through the window of Mrs. Reynolds' classroom, he could see her sitting with a small group of students before class, genuinely engaged in what appeared to be an animated discussion about problem-solving approaches. "Dad?" Adam's voice pulled him back to the present. "Do you think things would have changed like this if Mrs. Reynolds hadn't been mean to me that day?" David thought carefully before answering. Sometimes, Adam, the most important changes come from difficult moments. What matters is not that Mrs. Reynolds made a mistake, but that she chose to learn from it. And look at what that choice led to, not just for her, but for the whole school. As they watched, more students entered the classroom, naturally forming small study groups. The nervous energy that used to permeate Mrs. Reynolds's class had been replaced by an atmosphere of cooperative learning and mutual respect. You know what's really cool? Adam added. Yesterday, Mrs. Reynolds asked me to help tutor some 6th graders. She said my way of explaining things helps them understand better. David felt a surge of pride, not just in his son's academic growth, but in his emotional maturity. The incident that could have left Adam feeling victimized had instead empowered him to become a leader and helper to others. As David walked back to his car, he received an email from the school district superintendent. Other schools had heard about Pine Grove's transformation and wanted to implement similar programs. The small ripple that started with one homework assignment was becoming a wave of positive change throughout the educational community. But perhaps the most significant change was happening quietly, in countless small moments throughout the school day. Students who once felt out of place were finding their voices. Teachers who had stuck to rigid methods were discovering the joy of creative instruction. And parents who had felt disconnected from their children's education were becoming active participants in the learning process. The story of Adam's homework and Mrs. Reynolds's transformation had become more than just a tale of conflict and resolution. It had become a catalyst for reimagining what education could be when everyone's unique perspective was valued and respected. A month had passed, and Pine Grove Middle School was preparing to host its first Educational Innovation Fair. The event had started as a simple showcase of the new learning methods but had grown into something much bigger. Schools from across the district were sending representatives, and local news outlets had picked up the story. Adam stood in the transformed gymnasium, helping to set up displays that showed different learning approaches. His math journal, now expanded into a collaborative project with contributions from dozens of students, had its own booth. But what made him most proud wasn't the attention, it was watching a group of 6th graders confidently explaining their problem-solving methods to visiting teachers. "You've created quite something here," a voice said behind him. Adam turned to see Mrs. Reynolds, who was carrying a stack of student projects. The change in her was remarkable. Her hair, once pulled back in a severe bun, now fell in soft waves, and her smile came naturally. "We all did it together," Adam replied, helping her with the displays. "I never thought so many people would be interested in different ways to solve math problems." Mrs. Reynolds paused, arranging a set of creative geometry projects. "You know, Adam, I've been teaching for 15 years, and I thought I knew everything about how math should be taught. But this past month has taught me more than all those years combined." The gym was buzzing with activity as students and teachers set up their presentations. Each display told a story of transformation. The art teacher had a booth showing how she incorporated mathematical concepts into her lessons. The school chef had created a display about measuring ingredients that made fractions come alive. Even the custodian had contributed, demonstrating how he used geometry to efficiently clean the school's floors. David arrived early, before the official start of the fair, carrying boxes of materials from EDU Tech. As he helped set up, he noticed something remarkable. Students who had once been labeled as struggling were now confidently leading demonstrations. The hierarchy of good and bad students had dissolved, replaced by an appreciation for different kinds of intelligence. The superintendent arrived with principals from other schools, their interest evident as they moved from booth to booth. They stopped at Adam's display, where he was demonstrating his alternative approach to algebra. "And you see," Adam explained, drawing a diagram, "when you visualize the equation this way, it's like telling a story with numbers. Some people understand it better when they can see the relationship between the variables." The superintendent turned to David, clearly impressed. "Mr. Chen, what you and Pine Grove have accomplished here goes beyond academic improvement. You've created a model for inclusive education that could benefit schools everywhere." David smiled, watching his son confidently field questions from educators twice his age. The credit goes to the students and teachers. They were brave enough to embrace change and support each other through it. As the fair opened to the public, parents began streaming in. Many were surprised to see their children, who had once been reluctant to participate in class, now eagerly showing visitors their projects. The local news crew arrived, interviewing students and teachers about the school's transformation. Mrs. Reynolds's booth attracted particular attention. She had created a display showing the before and after of her teaching methods, openly sharing her journey from rigid traditionalist to adaptive educator. "It took a 12-year-old to teach me that being a good teacher means being a good learner," she told the reporter. During a quiet moment, Adam found himself standing next to his father, watching the bustling fair. "Dad," he said thoughtfully, "remember when you said what you do isn't who you are?" David nodded, wondering where his son was going with this. "I think I understand that better now," Adam continued. "Being good at math isn't just about getting the right answers, it's about helping others understand things in their own way." A commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A group of students from a neighboring middle school had arrived, looking around with mixture of curiosity and hope. Their teacher approached David and Mrs. Reynolds. "We've been hearing about what you've done here," she said earnestly. "Our students are struggling with traditional methods, and we're hoping to learn from your experience." Without hesitation, Adam stepped forward. "Would you like me to show you how we do things here?" he offered, reaching for his journal. The visiting students gathered around as Adam began explaining, their faces lighting up with understanding as he demonstrated different approaches to problem solving. Mrs. Reynolds watched proudly, remembering how she had once dismissed this same boy's methods. As the fair continued, Principal Thompson gathered everyone for a special announcement. "What started as a response to a single incident has grown into something extraordinary," he began. "Today, I'm proud to announce that Pine Grove will become a training center for teachers across the district, sharing our experiences and methods with other schools." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause, but the real magic was happening in the small interactions throughout the gym. Students who had never spoken to each other were discovering shared interests. Parents were learning new ways to help their children with homework. Teachers were exchanging ideas and techniques. David watched it all with quiet satisfaction, remembering the painful moment that had started this journey. He caught Mrs. Reynolds's eye across the room, and they shared a knowing look. Sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected beginnings. As the day drew to a close, Adam found himself surrounded by a group of students from various schools, all eagerly copying pages from his journal. One of them looked up at him with earnest eyes. "Do you think I could start something like this at my school?" "Of course," Adam replied without hesitation. "The most important thing is to believe in yourself and help others believe in themselves too." The fair had accomplished something remarkable. It had shown that education wasn't about fitting students into a single mold, but about creating an environment where every kind of learner could thrive. The story that began with a harsh judgment and a red-marked homework assignment had transformed into a movement of understanding, acceptance, and growth. The success of the Educational Innovation Fair had sparked something unexpected. 2 months after the event, Pine Grove Middle School had become a beacon of educational innovation, hosting weekly visits from teachers and administrators across the state. But today was special. It was the day of the first Student Teaching Summit, where students would lead workshops for educators. Adam stood in front of the mirror at home, adjusting his collar nervously. He was scheduled to lead the opening session, sharing his story and teaching methods with over 100 educators. David watched his son with pride, remembering the shy boy who had once been afraid to show his homework solutions. "You know, Dad," Adam said, fiddling with his note cards, "I keep thinking about something. Remember how awful I felt that day in Mrs. Reynolds's class? Now I'm actually grateful it happened." David raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Why's that? Because sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes, Adam replied, showing wisdom beyond his years. If Mrs. Reynolds hadn't been so hard on me that day, none of this would have happened. At school, the atmosphere was electric with excitement. Students who had once been labeled as troublemakers or underachievers were now preparing to teach teachers. Ray, the quiet student who had hidden his unique problem-solving methods, was setting up a workshop on visual learning techniques. Lily, who had helped Adam understand polynomials through puzzle pieces, had created an entire mathematics game system. Mrs. Reynolds stood in her classroom, now barely recognizable from its former austere state. The walls were covered with student work, showing multiple approaches to solving each type of problem. She was reviewing her presentation for the summit when a familiar face appeared at her door. "Mrs. Chen," she said, surprised to see Adam's grandmother standing there. The elderly woman had flown in from California to see her grandson and son's work firsthand. "Please, call me Grace," the woman smiled warmly. "I wanted to see the classroom where everything changed." David told me the whole story. Mrs. Reynolds felt a flutter of shame, but Grace's kind expression put her at ease. "I learned more from my mistake than I had in years of teaching," she admitted. "Sometimes our greatest teachers are our students," Grace replied wisely. "I was a teacher in China for 30 years before coming to America. I had to learn everything again, including that there's always more to learn." The summit began with Adam's presentation. Standing at the podium, he looked out at the sea of faces, teachers, administrators, and fellow students all waiting to hear his story. Taking a deep breath, he began. "6 months ago, I thought I was bad at math because I solved problems differently," he started. "Today, I know that being different isn't being wrong, it's just seeing things in your own way. And sometimes, your way might be exactly what someone else needs to understand." The audience listened intently as Adam shared his journey, from the devastating moment of being told he wasn't cut out for academic success, to becoming a peer teacher helping others find their own path to understanding. He demonstrated his methods, showing how visual learners could grasp algebraic concepts through diagrams, how story-based problems could help literary minds connect with numbers, and how physical movement could help kinesthetic learners understand geometry. Throughout the day, different students led workshops, each sharing their unique approaches to learning. Ray's session on visual mathematics had teachers frantically taking notes. Lily's mathematical games workshop had educators playing like children, experiencing firsthand how fun learning could be. During lunch, David found himself sitting with a group of principals from inner-city schools. "The beautiful thing about this approach," one principal noted, "is that it doesn't require expensive technology or resources. It just requires us to open our minds to different ways of thinking." Mrs. Reynolds's workshop was particularly powerful. She stood before her colleagues, sharing her transformation from a rigid traditionalist to an adaptive educator. "I used to think my job was to mold students to fit the system," she admitted. "Now I understand that my job is to help the system fit the students." The day took an unexpected turn when a student from a visiting school raised his hand during a panel discussion. "At my school, teachers still make fun of students who think differently," he said quietly. "How can we change that?" Adam looked at Mrs. Reynolds, who nodded encouragingly. "Change starts with one person being brave enough to speak up," he replied. "Maybe you could start a student support group, where people can share different ways of learning without being judged." The summit's final session was led by Grace Chen, who shared her experience of teaching in 2 different cultures. "In China, I taught students to follow one path perfectly," she explained. "In America, I learned from my grandson that there are many paths to understanding. Both approaches have value, but together they create something even more powerful." As the day drew to a close, Principal Thompson made an announcement that brought tears to many eyes. "Today, we're launching the Chen Reynolds Educational Initiative," he revealed. This program, funded by EDU Tech Solutions and supported by our school district, will help other schools implement inclusive learning approaches and student-led teaching programs. The name of the initiative, combining the names of the student who sparked change and the teacher who embraced it, symbolized the partnership between educators and learners that had made Pine Grove's transformation possible. Later that evening, as Adam and his father walked through the empty school halls, they paused by Mrs. Reynolds's classroom. The room that had once been a place of humiliation had become a symbol of transformation. "You know what's funny, Dad?" Adam said, looking at the colorful displays of student work. "When I was younger, I used to think being successful meant having all the right answers. Now I know it's about helping others find their own answers." David squeezed his son's shoulder, remembering the painful day that had started it all. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who aren't afraid to show that they're still learning too. As they left the building, they passed a group of visiting teachers still deep in discussion about implementing changes in their own schools. The ripple effect that had started with one homework assignment was becoming a wave of educational reform, touching lives far beyond the walls of Pine Grove Middle School. The story of a teacher's mistake and a student's resilience had transformed into a movement, proving that sometimes the greatest lessons come from our most challenging moments. 6 months after the Student Teaching Summit, Pine Grove Middle School was preparing for an event that none of its students or staff had ever imagined possible. The Department of Education had selected their school to host the National Conference on Educational Innovation, bringing together educators from all 50 states to learn about their groundbreaking approach to learning. The morning of the conference, Adam stood in the school courtyard, watching buses arrive from across the country. The nervous 12-year-old who had once dreaded math class was now 13, and had grown into a confident young leader. His math journal had evolved into a published guidebook, Learning Your Way, which was being distributed to schools nationwide. Pretty amazing, isn't it? Mrs. Reynolds appeared beside him, carrying a stack of conference programs. Like Adam, she had grown tremendously over the past year. Her classroom had become a model for adaptive teaching, and she now conducted training sessions for teachers across the country. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," Adam admitted, helping her with the programs. "You know what's really cool? Yesterday, I got an email from a kid in Florida who said my book helped him stop being afraid of math." Inside the school, David was meeting with education officials and principals in the library, which had been transformed into a welcome center. The Chin Reynolds initiative had already been implemented in over 200 schools, with remarkable results. Test scores were up, but more importantly, student engagement and confidence had soared. The beauty of this program, David explained to the gathered educators, is that it wasn't created in a boardroom. It grew organically from a real classroom experience, shaped by real students and teachers learning together. The conference opened with a unique panel discussion. Instead of the usual lineup of education experts, the speakers were students from various schools that had adopted the program. Ray, once too shy to speak up in class, was now confidently explaining how visual learning techniques had transformed his understanding of mathematics. "Before this program," Ray shared, "I thought I was just bad at math. Now I know that everyone's brain works differently, and that's not a weakness, it's a strength." Lily followed with a demonstration of her mathematical games, which had been refined and developed into a full curriculum supplement. Teachers in the audience were particularly moved when she shared how her previous struggles with math had inspired her to create tools that made learning more accessible for others. The day's highlight was a joint presentation by Adam and Mrs. Reynolds, titled "The Homework That Changed Everything." As they took the stage together, the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The student and teacher whose conflict had sparked a national movement now stood as partners in educational reform. "A year ago," Mrs. Reynolds began, "I thought I knew exactly what a good student looked like. I thought there was only one right way to solve a problem. I was never more wrong in my life." Adam picked up the story, sharing how his different approach to problem solving had been dismissed before becoming the catalyst for change. But he didn't focus on the negative aspects of that day. Instead, he emphasized how it had led to positive transformation. The most important lesson wasn't about math at all, he explained to the packed auditorium. It was about seeing mistakes as opportunities to learn and grow. Both students and teachers need to feel safe making mistakes. That's how we discover new ways of understanding. During the lunch break, Grace Chen, who had become a regular visitor to Pine Grove, led a workshop on bridging cultural approaches to education. Her experience teaching in both Asian and American schools provided valuable insights into creating truly inclusive learning environments. In my 50 years of teaching, Grace shared, I've learned that wisdom can come from unexpected places. Sometimes it takes a child to remind us that there's always more to learn. The afternoon sessions focused on practical implementation. Mrs. Reynolds demonstrated how she had redesigned her classroom to accommodate different learning styles. The traditional rows of desks had been replaced with flexible learning stations. Walls that once displayed only rules and formulas now showcased multiple approaches to problem solving. The physical changes in the classroom are important, she explained, but the real transformation happens in how we think about learning. Every student who walks through that door brings a unique perspective that can enrich our understanding. One of the most powerful moments came when a group of students from struggling schools shared their experiences implementing the program. A girl from an underfunded inner-city school described how the approach had helped her class overcome limited resources through collaborative learning. We don't have fancy technology, she explained, but we have each other. When we started sharing different ways of understanding concepts, it was like having 20 teachers in one classroom. Principal Thompson presented data showing the program's impact: improved test scores, increased attendance, reduced behavioral issues, and higher teacher satisfaction rates. But the most compelling statistics weren't about academics, they were about student well-being. Reports of anxiety and stress had decreased significantly, while measures of self-confidence and peer support had risen dramatically. As the conference drew to a close, the Secretary of Education made a surprise announcement. The Chen Reynolds Initiative would receive federal funding to expand to schools nationwide, with Pine Grove serving as the flagship training center. That evening, as the last buses departed, Adam and his father walked through the quiet halls of Pine Grove. They paused by the display case where Adam's original homework assignment was now preserved, the red mark still visible but transformed from symbols of failure into badges of change. "You know what's funny, Dad?" Adam said, looking at the framed assignment. "That day, I thought Mrs. Reynolds was just judging my homework. But she was really judging herself, too. We all were learning things about ourselves we didn't know." David nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. We just have to be brave enough to learn from them. Outside the school, a new banner hung above the entrance: "Welcome to Pine Grove Middle School, where every way of learning has a home." The words reflected not just a school motto, but a revolution in education that had started with one homework assignment and one teacher's willingness to change. The story that began with judgment and hurt had blossomed into a testament to the power of understanding, growth, and the courage to see things differently. As the sun set on Pine Grove Middle School, its shadows stretched long across the playground, much like the impact of its simple but powerful message was reaching across the nation, touching lives one classroom at a time. 1 year to the day after Mrs. Reynolds had criticized Adam's homework, Pine Grove Middle School was hosting a very special celebration. The Chen Reynolds Initiative had reached its 100th school, and students from across the country had gathered to share their stories of transformation. The school gymnasium, once a place of routine assemblies, had been transformed into a showcase of educational innovation. Photos lined the walls, telling the story from that fateful day to the present: Mrs. Reynolds's old classroom with its rigid rows of desks, the first collaborative learning sessions, the student teaching summit, and the national conference that had changed everything. Adam, now in 8th grade, stood before a display case containing his original homework assignment. Next to it was his published book, Learning Your Way, which had become a national bestseller in educational literature. A young girl approached him, clutching her own copy of the book. "Are you really the Adam from the story?" she asked shyly. "The one who solved math problems differently?" Adam smiled warmly. "That's me. But you know what's more important? Everyone has their own story about learning differently. What's yours?" As the girl began sharing her experiences, David watched from across the room, his heart full of pride. His son had grown not just in height but in wisdom, turning what could have been a traumatic experience into a source of strength for others. Mrs. Reynolds was there too, but she was hardly recognizable as the stern teacher who had once marked assignments with such harsh judgment. She was surrounded by a group of teachers from various schools, sharing stories about their own journeys of transformation. "The hardest part," she admitted to her colleagues, "wasn't changing my teaching methods. It was changing my mindset. I had to learn that being a good teacher meant being a good learner first." The celebration included live video feeds from schools across the country that had implemented the program. Each school shared unique adaptations they'd made to suit their community's needs. An inner-city school in Chicago showed how they'd turned their cafeteria into a collaborative learning space during lunch breaks. A rural school in Texas demonstrated how they used agricultural concepts to teach mathematical principles. Principal Thompson took the stage to make a special announcement. "Today, we're not just celebrating numbers, though reaching 100 schools is remarkable. We're celebrating a fundamental shift in how we think about education. And it all started with one homework assignment and the courage to learn from our mistakes." The audience fell silent as a surprise guest appeared on the big screen, the Secretary of Education, speaking live from Washington, D.C. "The Chin Reynolds Initiative has shown us something remarkable," she began. "When we embrace different ways of learning, we don't just improve education, we transform lives. Today, I'm proud to announce that this program will become a cornerstone of our national education policy." The announcement was met with thunderous applause, but the most touching moment came next. Students from the original Pine Grove class began sharing their stories of where they were now. Ray, the once quiet visual learner, had started a peer tutoring program that had spread to dozens of schools. Lily's mathematical games were being manufactured and distributed to classrooms nationwide. Even the school custodian who had shared his geometric cleaning patterns had become a regular speaker at educational conferences, showing how practical knowledge could enhance classroom learning. Grace Chen, who had been instrumental in bridging Eastern and Western educational philosophies, shared her perspective. "In my culture, we have a saying, every child carries a unique gift. For too long, we tried to make all gifts look the same. Now we understand that true education means helping each child unwrap their gift in their own way." As the day progressed, David was asked to speak about the technology aspect of the initiative. But instead of discussing EduTech's latest innovations, he shared something more personal. "You know," he began, "people often ask me how our company developed such effective educational software. The truth is, we didn't develop it, we learned it. We learned it from teachers like Mrs. Reynolds, who had the courage to change. We learned it from students like my son, who showed us that different isn't wrong. Every line of code we write is based on real experiences from real classrooms." The celebration culminated in a unique ceremony. Instead of traditional awards, students and teachers wrote messages of appreciation to someone who had helped them learn differently. These messages were collected into a digital time capsule, to be shared with future educators as a reminder of how change begins with understanding. As the event drew to a close, Adam found himself back at Mrs. Reynolds's classroom. The room had become a model for adaptive learning spaces nationwide, but it still held the special energy of where everything had started. "It feels different now, doesn't it?" Mrs. Reynolds said, joining him at the door. "Everything feels different," Adam replied thoughtfully. "But you know what's really amazing? Some things that seemed so wrong back then turned out to be exactly right." Mrs. Reynolds nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. "Your father told me something once that I'll never forget. He said success isn't about having power or position, it's about how you use your experiences to help others grow. As they walked back to the gymnasium for the closing ceremony, they passed groups of students and teachers engaged in animated discussions about learning styles, teaching methods, and the future of education. The hallways that had once echoed with traditional lectures now buzzed with the energy of collaborative learning. David joined them, carrying Adam's original journal, the one that had started as a personal math guide and grown into a movement. "Ready for the final presentation?" he asked. Adam looked at his father and his former teacher, now both mentors and partners in education reform. "You know what I'm going to talk about? Not about math, or teaching methods, or even about change. I'm going to talk about how sometimes the biggest mistakes can lead to the most beautiful outcomes." The story that began with a harsh judgment on a homework assignment had become a testament to the power of understanding, growth, and the courage to see things differently. But perhaps the most powerful lesson wasn't about education at all, it was about how every moment, even the painful ones, carries the seed of positive transformation. As the sun set on Pine Grove Middle School, casting long shadows across the playground, the building stood as more than just a school. It had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that education isn't about fitting students into a system, but about helping each person find their own path to understanding. The red marks on that original homework assignment had faded over time, but the impact of what they sparked would continue to grow, touching lives and transforming education, one classroom at a time. In the end, it wasn't just about learning differently, it was about learning to see the extraordinary potential in every ordinary moment.